Hello and welcome to a screencast on Chapter 3 of Streitmatter's Mightier Than the Sword, Slowing the Momentum for Women's Rights. In the first chapter, we looked at the role of the press in sowing the seeds of revolution. It is worth noting in the context of the current chapter that women performed many functions during the Revolutionary War. As Birkin in her book points out, women performed domestic chores for the army. They sometimes served as spies or soldiers, and perhaps most importantly and most pervasively, they kept farms and businesses running for the 8 years of the war. Despite their contributions and Abigail Adams' request of her husband that they not forget the women in the early republic gradually lost the right to vote, with the last state of the new republic taking away the right of women to vote in 1807 in New Jersey. In the Civil War, we see a very similar pattern with women who have, remember at this point, already begun their struggle to win the vote, or win back the vote, if you will. But they suspend their suffrage activities to help maintain the war effort, doing many of the same tasks as they performed in the period of the War for Independence. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, one of the suffragists that we will examine in this chapter, wrote of the Civil War that the story of the Civil War will never be fully written if the achievements of women are left untold. Women's actions in the Civil War period and in the abolitionist movement leading up to the Civil War were an important contribution to the cause, and this chapter focuses on the role of the press in slowing the momentum for women's rights. The story of this chapter begins with the convention at Seneca Falls in 1848. We should recognize that the woman suffrage amendment is introduced into the U.S. Congress 30 years later in 1878, and it remains unchanged when it is finally passed by both houses in 1919 and ratified in 1920. The role of the press then in the role of the press in this case then is to prevent a group from achieving equality. While in the first two chapters we looked at the press and its positive contributions to the cause of freedom, whether it be freedom from the tyranny of Great Britain or freedom from the tyranny of the institution of slavery. In both instances, the press played a heroic role in the struggle. In this chapter, we look at an instance in which the press plays a shameful role in slowing the effort of women to gain some measure of equality. As Streitmatter points out, one of the most serious impediments to the march toward gender equality was the same force that already had built a record as a highly influential institution in American history, the news media. Threatened by the possibility that women might be rising from their second-class citizenship to command a share of the male power base, the men who dominated American journalism ignored the women's rights movement, or when they did cover it, did so with mockery and disdain. From the beginning of the Republic, Streitmatter points out the media had worked to limit women's role in society, with publications of the late 18th century systematically restricting half the population to a narrow existence that had become known as the women's sphere, essentially the home. The so-called women's sphere or domestic sphere, of course, ignored the role played by women during the Revolutionary War period and later during the Civil War. For example, in 1777, Mary Catherine Goddard printed the Declaration of Independence. Women were not explicitly excluded from participating in the rights of citizenship, but in fact women had little legal status, and what Abigail Adams sought from her husband was not so much the kind of political equality that we associate with the later women's movement, but the property restrictions that women faced. Women gave up their property when they married. Their property became their husbands, among other barriers they faced. And in the event of a divorce, that property would be forfeited to the husband. The primary publishing venue for disseminating messages about the women's place then was a handful of women's magazines that began to emerge in the late 18th century. Women's magazines were by no means vehicles of advocacy for the rights and interest of women. They were instead vehicles for oppression of women. In Ladies' Magazine, for example, we find the statement, "The number of women who have solid judgment is very small." Or in the American Museum, "The author of Nature has placed the balance of power on the side of the male by giving him not only a body more large and robust, but also a mind endowed with greater resolution and a more extensive reach." The message, according to Streitmatter, was that domesticity dominated women's very being because they were not capable of acting autonomously in the public sphere. Now keep in mind, the histories of both of the previous periods that we've studied have demonstrated time and again that women are in fact very capable of acting autonomously in the public sphere, but that would challenge the status quo, and women's magazines were devoted to reinstating and reinforcing that status quo. The message was repeated so often in the key cultural institutions of the day, in the church, in the media, and in the little schooling that women had access to, that women themselves, in most cases, accepted their status as natural. According to Gail Dines and Jean Humez, this would constitute an example of hegemony, And hegemony, as they define it, is a process by which those in power secure the consent of the socially subordinated to the system that oppresses or subordinates them. Rather than requiring overt force as represented by the military or police, the elite, through their control of religious, educational, and media institutions, attempt to persuade the populace that the hierarchical social and economic system is fixed and natural and therefore unchangeable. This chapter is a stark example of the role of the news media in hegemony. I should point out Dines and Humes include reference to Gramsci's firm belief that hegemony was always being challenged, and that you could, through the use and production of counter-hegemonic messages, you could challenge and change the status quo, which we see happen by the end of this chapter, but we see it take some 70 years before the change comes about, precisely because, as Streitmatter argues in this chapter, the role of the news media in maintaining the status quo. After the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, the news media goes from patronizing and paternalistic to openly hostile. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who I quoted earlier, was the leading theorist, writer, and speaker for the women's rights movement. She was the initiator of the Seneca Falls Convention. Also important to the movement were Lucretia Mott and Amelia Bloomer, who attended the Seneca Falls Convention. They had both gained experience working with the abolition and temperance movements. That is, they had prior experience with other social movements. Mott and Stanton had met at the International Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England, in the spring of 1840, and both had been refused seats because of their gender. Despite their important contributions to the abolitionist movement, they were not considered worthy of having a voice in the International Convention. Garrison, to his credit, refused his seat in protest. At the Seneca Falls Convention, a resolution for women's suffrage was the only one that did not pass unanimously, and it only passed at all thanks to an impassioned plea by Frederick Douglass. Streitmatter points out that American newspapers responded to the convention with a toxic mixture of outrage, contempt, and mockery, all forms of social control designed to slow the advancement of women. Right? Another important suffragist is Susan B. Anthony, who emerged as an important complement to Stanton in Streitmatter's words. She had, like others, gained experience in the temperance and abolition movements, and she remained unmarried, which for a woman who wanted to be independent was really the only available choice. The way in which the press dealt with Anthony is reflected in this period cartoon, where she is shown chasing Grover Cleveland in a caricature of her image